is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers who will lead the asset management online workshop entitled Building Asset Management Maturity while working toward compliance, the journey so far and what's ahead. Please join me in welcoming John Murray, General Manager, Asset Management Strategy and Performance at PSD Citywide, Inc. May Abdu, Asset Management Consultant, PSD Citywide, Inc. Jordan Gonda, Asset Management Consultant, PSD Citywide, Inc. Michael McGovern, Treasurer and MFOA Board Member at the Township of Central Frontenac, and Amanda Brooks, Asset Management Coordinator for Grey County. Their full bios and session abstracts are located on the conference website, and I will send it over to our friends at PSD Citywide.
That's great. Thank you very much, Trevor, for the introductions. Really appreciate that. And yeah, nice to see so many people online this early in the morning. Great attendance already. We're thrilled to be here on day one at this 3-day event. Really good agenda put together by MFOA, no surprise, and great sessions across the 3 days. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, and I think we're ready to go. Yeah, so thank you very much. So we have to start the day, we have a 3-hour workshop on asset management, and I can tell everyone must be really excited about that. And what we're going to do throughout this workshop, we're going to make sure that it's very interactive. We're going to get everyone involved. We have polling questions. We have interactive breakout sessions. So, you know, it's not just watching us speak for 3 hours. We're going to get everyone thoroughly involved. As Travis said, it's the title of the session is Building Asset Management Maturity while Working Towards Ontario Regulation Compliance. But what we want to talk about is the journey so far, what's been done to date a little bit, but more importantly, what's ahead. And that really ties into the conference theme of reimagine your future. You know, how will this look in the future as we are the custodians of these infrastructure assets that supply so much service to the public. So the agenda that we're going to go through today, we're going to start just by introducing some of the key topics within the Ontario regulation. A quick review of the regulation itself, just to ground the session. It's important that people know the various components that need to be addressed, but we're also going to have some good interactive polling questions in this first segment. After that, we're going to go straight to an interactive session on levels of service. And in breakout groups, you're going to work on some key exercises we already have in place. Built into this 3-hour workshop, we have 2 case studies as well. So we thought it would be very interesting for you to see your municipal colleagues. What are they doing in asset management? So first of all, really pleased to have Michael McGovern from Central Frontenac doing a case study on a smaller municipality and what have they achieved, and they made great strides in their asset management programs. That'll be followed, so we'll be about an hour and a half in at that point with a 15-minute break. Then our second case study, a larger municipality, Grey County, about 100,000, and they got a bit of a unique approach to how they've looked at their asset management programs. So we'll see that when we get there. That will be followed by a second interactive breakout session. Once again, everyone will be involved in breakout groups in the discussion in an exercise on lifecycle management and risk. And then finally, we'll wrap up the day with, it's a very important subject, the proposed level of service, the kind of the final piece of the Ontario regulation. How do you plan for that? And probably more importantly, how do you communicate that forward to council and senior management? So we'll talk about that as well. A couple of housekeeping items before I move forward. We do have a lot of polling questions as we go through. So you should have, all you need is your smartphone. Nearly everyone has one today, of course. Or if you have a laptop, you can do that as well. We'll give you shortly the instructions how to get in, log into this polling sessions we have in place. So have that ready. For the interactive breakout sessions, if you look at the agenda on the MFOA conference website, and you go to our session, you'll see that there's downloadable materials. And it wouldn't be a bad thing to do that straight away. So both breakout sessions, there's information you can download that will be pertinent to those sessions. So you want to have that either ready on a laptop If you want to print a hard copy, that's fine too. But you want to have that ready so you can view it when we get to those sessions. It's got all the information you require. Other than that, for the duration of the session, everyone's going to be on mute. But we will have times where we'll ask people to get involved in some conversation, especially at the end of the breakout session. So we'll ask people to raise their hands if they want to comment, and then they can unmute themselves once we give them the green light and get involved in the conversation. So once again, thank you very much. So to start with the polling questions, you can see the slide here. There's two ways to get into the interactive polling questions. You can either go to www.menti.com, as it says on the slide, or a lot of us have done this lately with COVID protocols. If you scan the QR code with your smartphone, that will directly take you to the polling questions as well. So I'll just give everyone a few seconds. The key thing, so once again, www.menti.com, and then enter the code. And if you feel a bit rushed, no worries. The code is at the top of the slide here. And as I go forward with the next slides, the code will remain. So, as I'm about to go to the next slide, but feel, that code will remain in place if you haven't got there yet. And some of you may be scanning the QR code right now on your phone. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a few seconds and I'll take a sip of my coffee. Okay, so we'll move forward to the first question. So, okay, so it's early in the morning, so let's be polite. For the sake of saying we do have a profanity filter on this one, but what is the first word that comes to mind when you think of asset management? PSD came in straight away. I love that. We paid that person. The check is in the mail. This is great. And right now in attendance, we have a little over 300 participants. So fantastic attendance on the line already. And this is looking really good. And we're going to save the results of these polls and they can be shared after the fact with attendees as well. And I love the fact that planning, great word, sustainability, infrastructure, of course, assets, some really good buzzwords coming up. Yeah, that's a nice looking word cloud. Okay, thanks very much. And we got a few more key questions just to get everyone involved straight away this morning. We thought it was good to poll the audience just to get a sense of the size of your municipality. And you guys are very awake this morning. You're flying in with the answers. This is great. So as we expected, there's going to be a significant portion of the audience coming from larger municipalities. But it's good to see that there's still all sizes of municipality are represented today. So that's going to be great. And it's going to be great for the discussions when we get to the breakout sessions as well. And nice to see that the very small, the less than 5,000, there's still 7% of attendees coming from the very small municipalities. So that's very good to see. Okay, thank you. So the next question, just to get a sense of where you think you are in your asset management program's maturity, how sophisticated or mature do you regard your asset management program? And, it's not with a lot of detailed analysis here, it's just a general feeling of where you think you're at. Some good numbers coming in the answers. So that's great to see that everyone's managed to get logged into the polling questions. It seems like the trend is generally intermediate, followed by beginner. And there's a few folks out there who feel like they're advanced, and that's fantastic. Okay. Good to see you guys. So the next question. So this is just, some things on the O.Reg already. We think this will be very strong. Have you already had an asset management policy approved through your council? And of course, this had to be done by July the 1st, 2019, but there's still some folks who haven't quite achieved that milestone, which is fine. Just trying to get a sense of where people are at. So it sounds like a resounding yes. Very good to see. And this one's a little bit more detailed. So which component of the O.Reg do you feel you need more help with? And this is, you're going to add in multiple answers because there may be different things. Levels of service. Obviously, this is a fairly new concept. Municipalities, we're in the business of delivering levels of service, but quantifying what that means has always been difficult. Risk management is new to some folks. Life cycle management, absolutely new to some folks. Data and inventory can be challenging to keep your data current, accurate, and good procedures in place to maintain that over time, and tie in everything into that ultimate financial strategy, of course. So, yeah, it's what we expected. We're getting a bit of a mixed bag of answers. Good to see. But it seems to be the leader that most people need help with is defining levels of service. So that's good. We have a full breakout session. We'll get into detailed discussions on level of service. And at the very end of this workshop, we have a session on looking at proposed levels of service and how you communicate that to senior management and council as well. So that's good to see us come forward as a trend. Okay, so the next question, how would you describe your understanding of O.Reg 588 and the components required up until 2025? Do you feel like you have an excellent understanding? Is it very good? Is it fair? Or do you feel like it's a bit poor? And if it is, you're in the right session, because that's what today's all about. We're going to educate you all the way through on that. No, it's great to see the answers coming in. And to be expected, only a few with an excellent understanding. Many folks, they're doing many things in the day jobs. The Ontario regulation is only one piece, and fair, of course, is coming out very strong. And then there's still a lot of folks saying they have a poor understanding, just over 1/3 of the audience today. So that's interesting. Okay, so we're going to go to the next question. Has your municipality finalized your O.Reg core assets AMP? So that's the first flavor of AMP. Most of you will know it was originally due on July 1st, 2021. And the province extended all the timelines on March the 17th. That was St. Patrick's Day. Some people call that their lucky day. And they got 1 year extension on every single AMP. And that core assets, once again, relates to roads, bridges, water, wastewater, and stormwater. And that's interesting to see. So we know some folks would have had that done, especially they were trying to hit the original timeline, but I'm sure a lot of folks were really very relieved to get that 1 year extension. And the numbers showing that it's over 2/3 right now on the screen have not completed that core assets AMP yet. And of course, there's time now. It's not due until July 1st, 2022. Next question. Now, what is your primary role, position? And there may be no surprises here as the finance comes flying in on the bar graph. But we just wanted to gauge, sometimes at these large conferences, we're starting to see a mix of folks these days. And even within, finance roles, we're starting to see more asset management coordinators. But we still figured that finance would be the primary bar on this graph. We were hoping that we may see the occasional public works or engineering staff, but it's looking pretty sad in that regard right now. So we'll keep a look as the answers come in. Okay, so overwhelmingly finance, and that is not a surprise. And this is going to be interesting when we get to the breakout sessions. We'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so thank you very much for answering some of those key questions. And I just got a few slides before we get into the breakout session. It's so this is a little dry, but to be honest, if we're going to talk about some key components of the Ontario regulation, we want to do a recap on what is required under that regulation. So the first thing that was required, and it looked like, the vast majority of people have done this, so I'll say it really quick, a strategic asset management policy was required by all municipalities by July 1st, 2019, and that milestone has passed. After that, and as you all well know, there's different flavors of asset management plan that are required. The first one, July 1st, 2022, for your core infrastructure assets, so your roads, bridges, water, wastewater, stormwater. And then a second asset management plan by July 1st, 2024, that includes all of the other asset classes within your municipalities as well. So that would be your vehicles, your buildings, your land assets, your machinery and equipment, etc. And then finally, there's an additional asset management plan due by July 1st, 2025, that goes into further detail. So on the next slides, I'm going to talk about the detail for each. So for those first two asset management plans, the core assets, July 1st, 2022, and the all assets, July 1st, 2024, these are the key elements that must be included. So, so you need to, the first difference for everybody was that you needed to quantify what is your current level of service for each one of the infrastructure programs. So your road network, what level of service is it currently supplied to this community? Your water distribution network, your portfolio of facilities. And that was a difficult one for everyone to wrestle with and something new. And hand in hand with that is, as well as the current level of service, what is the current performance of those assets within those programs? And you had to document some of the key risks that may affect that performance and affect that level of service moving forward. The next requirement was just the general inventory requirement. So that included the inventory of the assets themselves, pretty typical stuff. But also it included some key attribute data. So replacement cost, average age, condition information if it was available. And if it wasn't, you had to document your approach to collect condition data in the future. Something new as well, and we'll talk about this today, was life cycle events to maintain current levels of service. It was no longer just about end of life replacement of the assets. You had to at least document what do you typically do for different life cycle activities to maintain the performance of these assets over time. And then finally, there was some key elements on growth. So for municipalities under 25,000, just some assumptions on future population and economic activity. And for municipalities greater than 25,000, they had to have some more detail on estimated expenditures of growth activity as they move forward. And then finally, the last asset management plan, this is where it gets really interesting, I think, and we'll talk more about it today, is you have to say for all of your assets within the municipality, what is the proposed level of service? So you've already established the current level of service, but what is the proposed level of service you want to get to for each one of your infrastructure programs over the next 10 years? And you're going to need some detailed analysis on that, which we'll talk about at the end. And then an explanation the province requires why that proposed levels of service are appropriate for your community or your municipality. And that will take some analysis. Also, they want you to look at your proposed performance. So what would that proposed performance become across a 10-year period? And what risks will you need to mitigate, or what will the challenges be as you move forward? The life cycle management of the assets, and it's no longer just documenting them. You have to actually say the cost of the life cycle activities, and you have to incorporate that into your financial strategy. So that makes a lot more detailed analysis in the financial strategy component of the AMP. And then once again, you've got to handle the growth components as well. So just to finish up a few slides before I pass over. So there's two key approaches to that. And it's as all of the asset management plans done to date in Ontario, you could start looking at proposed levels of service in 2024, and you'd probably be a little bit too late to do the proper analysis. And you could produce an AMP that simply checks the boxes and kind of half-heartedly kind of gets there, but probably the wrong approach. The better approach, of course, is the second one here. So you start on some good analysis today and build upon it over the next few years. And in doing so, you bring everybody to the table and you actually build maturity within your asset management practice and programs that truly adds benefit and strategy to your community's infrastructure investments. You build a team, an asset management steering committee, you educate senior management, you educate council, and you build legacy programs that continue on. So it's not just about the plan itself. And that, of course, is the better approach. That's what we want to talk about today. Some of the key topics we're going to go through today, I'm going to cover this really quick in the interest of time so we can move on. Levels of service. The next breakout session is on levels of service. A lot of us have seen the tables that the province have on their website. But this view of level of service comes from the International Standard of Asset Management, the ISO 55000. And in that document, it says that level of service is the value you get from the asset. And the value you get from the asset in the public sector is the level of service that's provided. And the level of service is a balance of three key elements that you see on the screen. It's the performance of the assets in the field, how much it costs for the program, and how much risk is carried towards service delivery. An easy way to say that in layman's terms is for your road network, if it was the gold-plated standard in good condition at all times, it would have an amazing performance, but the cost is probably too high. The public don't expect blemish-free roads all times. So maybe it's too much cost on the public purse, but there's no risk to service failure. The other side of the coin is you have roads that are cracked, potholed everywhere, in really poor condition. There's not enough cost or money being put into that program, and there's a significant amount of risk to service failure. So we'll talk a lot more about level of service. That's the Coles notes. We're going to talk about life cycle management in one of the later breakout sessions as well. So to explain life cycle management in a really simple terms, this graph is showing you the levels, the number of years of service that an asset could be in the field. This one says 80 years because it's a water main, for instance. When the asset's at 0 years, it's 100% perfect condition, and it deteriorates over time. And a good asset manager knows that in the early years, we do maintenance activities. We then move over to preventative maintenance activities. We then move over to rehabilitation activities. And finally, we move over to replacement activities, and a different cost for each one of these activities. And if we do the right thing at the right time, when we do preventative maintenance activities, we actually can extend the life of the asset a little bit. If we capture the asset at the right time with a rehabilitation event, we can extend the life of the asset by a long way into the future. So the water main could actually last about 150 years by doing the right thing at the right time. And that's building true life cycle management into your capital programs and into your asset management plans. So that's it in a nutshell. We'll talk more about that as we go through. I'm just introducing these concepts very quickly. Risk management is new to a lot of folks. So the international standard for risk management is the ISO 31000. And their definition of risk is it's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So within your asset management policy, you have some key asset management objectives that you're trying to meet. And how will risk affect that? What is the uncertainty of risk not allowing you to meet those objectives? And in a nutshell, the risk equation from international best practice is risk equals the probability of failure of any infrastructure asset, but more importantly, multiplied by the consequence of that failure. And consequence of failure is the most important part in the public sector. How will this affect the community? A bridge failing is a much larger effect to the community than the failure of a local road, for instance. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward. And finally, before I pass off the presentation, the last piece we want to talk about, how do you communicate asset management? It's so key. So the last slide deck today, just some good techniques and good messages you can take to senior management council to communicate all of this in a simple way that the public would understand and that council will appreciate and council will get as well. So we hope we carry that on. So with that, thank you very much for listening to the open session. And I'm really pleased to pass you off to one of my esteemed colleagues, May Abdu, and she's going to take you through a segment on the first breakout session. Thank you very much. We're just going to transition.
Perfect. Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first activity of the day, the levels of service activity. Let me just see. Okay, that should be the right slideshow. Perfect. So welcome everyone to the first activity of the day, the levels of service activity. So as John mentioned, levels of service is a balance of the cost of providing that service, the performance of that service, and by extension, the performance of your assets and the risk that you're willing to tolerate. When it comes to the non-core assets, which is going to be the focus of our activity, the first thing you want to do is to identify your services. The reason I say that is because when it comes to the Ontario regulation, they do not mandate any of the metrics. So unlike the core assets where you do have some metrics that you need to track, the non-core assets are really up to the municipality to track however you want. So the first thing you want to do is to identify those services and by extension, the assets that are tied to that service. So when we think about emergency services, we're thinking fire halls, fire trucks, snow plows. Those are the assets that are tied to that service. From there, you want to know your influencers. So your influencers are the things that can impact the quality of that service that you're providing. So things like climate change or extreme weather, aging infrastructure, a change in the demographic or expectations of the public. Those are things that can impact those services. So once you know those two things, you can then define your current levels of service. And then come 2025, you have to set those targets or those proposed levels of service and assess whether or not you can achieve them. And so the first part of defining those levels of service is looking at what value do these services provide. So is it about accessibility? Is it reliability? Is it compliance-based? Is it sustainability? So of course, your service doesn't have to have all of these values, but you need to pick the ones that make most sense to that service. Once you've defined the core value that you care about, there's really two different types of level of service metrics that you care about. There's the community level of service, which is what your residents experience. That's the qualitative aspect that they see. And then the technical level of service, which is what your staff will be tracking. It's the quantitative metric that will translate back to what the customer or the resident feels. A good example of that would be the rideability of your roads or the Timmy's test, as we like to call it. So how smooth is your road? From a technical level of perspective or level of service, your staff can track that through an asset level. So they can track the percentage of your roads that are below a certain condition rating, or from an operational perspective, which is how many of those roads receive some sort of preventative maintenance like crack sealing. Those types of technical levels of service will enable you to measure the rideability service that you're providing. So that's what we're going to do with this activity right here. So let me pull it up for you. Give me 1 second. All right, so I hope everyone has this activity either printed off so you can fill it out manually or through the fillable PDF format. So it's really broken into two exercises. The first part is matching the service. So you'll see there's 3 different columns. You've got the asset class in one, the service statement, and the technical metrics. So in this exercise, the idea is to match the asset class to the most applicable service statement and then to the most applicable technical metric after that. So I'll give you an example with the roads here. So the number 1, that's the number for my roads. As I read through all of these service statements, the one that feels most applicable to me is this one right here. So allows safe and reliable passage throughout the municipality. And that makes sense. Our roads provide safe and reliable passage. And then as I read, so I put a number 1 right here. So that matches. And then as I read through the technical metrics, I want to see what metric enables me to track the safety and reliability of my roads. So as I read through it, the number of unplanned closures per year makes sense. That will track how reliable my roads are. So I put a 1 right next to that. So that's the first part of this exercise. So as you go through the other examples, you want to put the number right next to the most applicable service statement, and then right next to the most applicable technical metric. And I did not put any tracks in here. So every asset class will match to at least one service statement and one technical metric. Once you're done with that exercise, you're going to scroll down to the second part, which is your sustain the service exercise. And in this exercise, the idea is that you've been tracking your current levels of service for a while. So those technical metrics in that first exercise, you've been tracking those. And whether it's through public engagement, through staff and council discussions, you've defined what your proposed levels of service are going to look like. So in the example of the roads, our current the level of service is 4 unplanned closures per year. And now we're going down to 2 unplanned closures. So in this exercise, I would want you to list the different types of activities or different types of events or things that you would have to do to come down to that new proposed level of service. So in this example here, maybe we have to increase our inspection frequency so that we can catch these deficiencies earlier on. Maybe we have to increase our O&M budget. But as you go through these examples, I want you to keep an open mind and think about what your influencers might be. So maybe the reason we're getting so many unplanned closures is because we've got heavier traffic on some of our roads because of a new factory opening up, for example. And so the solution might be to downgrade some of those roads from asphalt to gravel. So I want you to keep an open mind, think about what are some of the potential influencers as we go through this. So you have to fill it out for the rest of these exercises. This is just the example to go through. So that's about it for the exercise. You have about 15 minutes to complete this. I would recommend that you spend about 7 minutes on each and then take a minute to either, check your answers or maybe discuss with the rest of your teams. So Abigail, or maybe if it's Eunice, if you want to break people up into their breakout sessions, that would be good. A really good tool is that if you do need assistance, there is a assistance button when you're in your breakout session. If you have any questions, I'll pop in, or maybe Jordan will. And after the 15 minutes, we'll come back and we'll discuss. Thanks, everyone. Perfect. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that was a good exercise. I know 15 minutes kind of flies by when you're going through this. So you can utilize the chat or the actual chat box if you want to upload your version of the activity so that you can continue the discussion in there as well. But we'll go through this activity, and let me just resume. You guys can see my screen. Perfect. So we'll get started with the first activity here. So if anyone wants to answer, please raise your hand and you can unmute yourself. If not, I will start volunteering people. So the first one we're going to go through is the playgrounds. So number 2. So does anyone want to share what they matched it to for service statement and technical metric? So again, you can just raise your hand and you can then unmute yourself. Monica?
We struggled a little bit with the parks stuff, so we went back and forth, but we thought it meets recreational needs and are reasonably accessible to the community. And then number of defects per year, TSSA, ESA, life safety. And
what were the other options that you kind of debated between?
Oh my God, like a million of them. I'm trying to think. The other one we thought was also enhances the quality of life for communities.
Yep.
And then I'm sorry, I'm forgetting which else. I'm just reading.
No, but that's a really good point. And that's why in the exercise, I said it's the most applicable because you can see a few of them apply and you can track different types of values. So absolutely, playgrounds do meet recreational needs for the community. And the key word in this one was reasonably accessible. So reasonably accessible, and you selected the number of defects and that's not incorrect. Like I said, there's no right or wrong answer. But when I think of accessibility, I don't necessarily think about defects off the top of my head. What I look at is how close it is to my residence, right? So one of the other options you could have as well is the number of playgrounds you have within 1 kilometer radius of residential area, right? So 1 kilometer radius is about a 10-minute walking distance. So that would measure how accessible it is to the community. But you're absolutely right, Monica. You can also track the number of defects on your playgrounds that don't match with CSA. Did anyone have any other technical metrics that they selected for the playgrounds? Salim, I see your hand up. Please unmute.
No, I put my hand for the for number 1. We put number 3, offers affordable activities for people of varying ages. So that we put number 3 as arena.
For the arena?
Yeah.
Okay. And then what did you select for the technical metric?
For the technical, for number 3, we selected the percentage of usage, ice pads and pools, the last one.
Yeah, absolutely. So that definitely does apply to the arena, right? You can measure the affordability of your activities in terms of usage. All right. Fantastic. So let's go through a different example for your vehicles here. So number 4, does anyone want to share what they came up with or what they matched to for number 4 for vehicles? Mervet, I see your hand up.
Yeah, we actually agreed on this. Number 4 will be assets are safe for occupants and do not cause hazard harm to staff and occupants. That's what we chose for number 4 as a service statement.
And then the applicable technical metric?
We chose the number of assets per 1,000 residents.
Okay. And so how does the asset class vehicles tie into that metric? So the number of vehicles per 1,000 residents, how does that tie back into the safety of your occupants when you're looking at the service statement? Because again, the technical metric has to tie right back to that service statement. Again, no wrong answers. It's really what
we were just kind of like between this one and then the one which is percentage of asset that mean accessibility standard. We were between this and that. So both of them, like one that you're performing service to all the residents and like the more vehicles, the more service, and the other is that it met the accessibility standard. So that's a safety. So
okay, that makes sense. What about this one down here? Supports the delivery of emergency services. Do you think that would apply to your vehicles?
Support the delivery of emergency. It would. We didn't know where to match this one at all because where the vehicles is the ambulance or the general vehicles that can help the residents. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So you've got your snow plows, you've got your fire trucks, all of those deliver or support the delivery of your emergency services. So those could apply as well. There's no wrong answers.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Mervet. Okay, so we'll move on. For the sake of time, we'll move into the second activity here. And again, as I said, you can use the chat function to discuss the rest of your answers for the first activity. But in the second activity here, let's go down to the first one here. So we're going from 70% of our library facilities meet accessibility, and that's our current. And now our proposed is that we go up to 100% of our facilities or library facilities meet accessibility. Who wants to share what they did? Kelly?
So we didn't get too far on it, but we said the first step would be to conduct an accessibility standards review to determine shortfalls.
Absolutely.
And we didn't really get much past that, ran out of time, but that was sort of like the key item to get you to the 100%.
Absolutely. Where is that 30% that you're missing? And then Kelly, in terms of if you're just thinking about influencers or things that might be impacting that service metric, you can think of the physical structure, right? The building, what is it missing? Is it, do we have ramps, elevator, accessible parking? But then what's the other option or the other side of accessibility as well? Can you think of that?
Just meeting the needs of the surrounding community?
Absolutely. So we're talking, one side is that physical structure, and then the other side is whether or not you have assistive technology, whether you have those accessibility needs for the community. Exactly. So with COVID, with the pandemic, do you have a homebound service that allows you to provide library materials to people that can't go to the library, right? Those are also kind of accessibility things that we have to think about. Those are influencers, right? COVID, the pandemic is a major influencer. So absolutely, that is a great point. We'll jump into the other one because I really want to go through this one as well. Thank you, Kelly. So the next one here is the number of playgrounds within the 10-minute radius. So you're going from 3 playgrounds to 1 playground. So this is a little bit different in that you're actually decreasing a level of service. So does anyone want to share their thought process through this one? If you had time to go through it. Susan B.
Yeah, so we were looking to say that we're going to look at the areas where there is a high population of children. And then from there, look to decrease the inspections or decommission parks using that metric.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What about the other thing that I think of sometimes is that maybe you're going from 3 smaller playgrounds to 1 large playground that would allow you to focus your effort, your funding into a more well-repaired or more well-maintained playground. So you're decreasing a level of service from a quantity perspective, but the quality is getting better. Celine, you had something to add, and I think, Celine, you'll be the last one to add something for this activity.
We said the planning and development department should be involved and public consultation should be done.
Absolutely, public engagement is important, right? You don't want a hot potato, a political hot potato on your hands. Absolutely. Okay, perfect. So thank you everyone for doing this exercise, for participating. I am going to pass it off to the lovely Michael McGovern, and I will stop sharing my screen.
All right, well, thank you. I'll just make a statement, May. Thanks for that, lovely Michael. I'm not sure how true that is, but listening to you this morning is both educational and stressing at the same time about all that we have to do, but we'll eat that elephant one bite at a time, of course. Yes, I can see it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Central Frontenac's asset management journey. John says that I have you for the next 4 hours, so let's buckle in and get moving forward. The one thing I do want to make a statement about is our council support has been great throughout this whole process and moving forward. And so I think that's key to achieving what we have achieved so far. So Central Frontenac was amalgamated in 1998 from the townships of Hinchinbrook, Oso, Olden, and Kennebec, and along with North Frontenac, South Frontenac, and the Frontenac Islands formed the county of Frontenac. We are located 45 minutes north of Kingston. We offer all the necessities of everyday living while enjoying the slower pace, familiar faces, and serenity of country life. Our location and proximity to many large economic centers such as Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto make Central Frontenac an ideal place to live, work, and visit, especially since Michael lives there. Come and explore our beautiful landscapes, plentiful lakes, and quaint villages, and find your personal treasure in the gem of the Frontenacs, which is located in the heart of the Land O'Lakes region and Frontenac County. It is the traditional territory of the Algonquin First Nations, spread across 1,025 square kilometers of unspoiled granite terrain. Its rolling hills, winding roads, rippling waters, and rugged terrain characterize this rural area and foster a traditional Canadian environment and lifestyle. Next page, please. So you can see below the summary of our asset management journey. We have completed 2 asset management plans, one in 2014 and one again in 2020 as a result of the asset management roadmap process with Public Sector Digest. In June of 2012, we purchased Citywide Asset Manager, Maintenance Manager, GIS Viewer, and Capital Planning Analysis modules. In 2018, we purchased the Permits modules and the budgeting module. This year, we've purchased the Citywide Asset Collector, Customer Reporting Portal, Route Patrol, and the e-permits module. Next slide, please. I think like most small municipalities, the challenges and struggles that are on your screen right now are what we all face. Staff turnover, we've had 5 different public works managers in the last 10 years, which makes it hard to gain traction since public works has most of our assets. Time, we all know, as we mention all the time, daily tasks take up a lot of time, yet alone trying to improve asset management practices. Money, it's always a challenge to pay for existing or additional staff or tools to focus solely on asset management. Training and education, it's hard to take time to get up to full speed, and there's a lot to know. Focus, obviously there's so many areas pulling our time, especially COVID, that seems to be harder and harder to focus on asset management. Next slide, please. I think we can all remember being in the same spot of doing nothing, simply buying and expensing that grader, not tracking any information related to it. So I really want us to stop and take a minute to think about where we were and where we are now and all that we have accomplished in our journey, and give ourselves credit for what we have accomplished, because I know I don't give ourselves enough credit. I recall having to pay our auditors big money to help use the previous asset management software by entering road assets due to its complexity of use. That was before we went to Public Sector Digest, where I was able to update information myself as the auditors were in the building. And it doesn't sound like much, but that felt like a really big win to me. Next slide, please. Thank you. When we started our journey with Public Sector Digest in 2012, through money that we received from the province to improve our asset management practices, we purchased the following modules on the screen. The amazing data analysts and all the staff, so they don't get in trouble, transferred our data from the previous system in such a quick and detailed fashion that I was thoroughly impressed. I've quite often made the comment they made roses out of manure. Next slide, please. I continue to be impressed with the staff at Public Sector Digest, as they are very intelligent, hardworking, and friendly employees that are always ahead of the game. John will give me my tip money later. And I'm, there's no tip money. They didn't coerce me into saying this. I truly believe in Public Sector Digest and their staff. They're awesome. Every conference, webinar, or training session makes me realize that as far as we have come in the process, that we still have a long way to go to improve our practices. PSD is always striving to be on the bleeding edge, and they continue to prove it to me time and time again. Next slide, please. Building on that relationship, in 2018, we purchased the Citywide Permits module, which was a lifesaver for its ease of use in our daily processes for our building permits. The building department certainly has appreciated it compared to what they were using before, which was, again, complex and frustrating. I rarely go into the permits module in Citywide, but I know that I can move around easily, and the reporting function for the monthly impact report helps saves our building department a lot of time. Next slide, please. Maintenance manager. In the past, the road concerns were always brought on into the reception desk and placed on a piece of paper, a complaint log, which was then given to the correct department. And in most cases, it could be lost or set aside with no real way of tracking the information. Now we're directly adding the information to the work order system. Any contact information, date, time, and any attachments can be attached to that work order and assigned to the appropriate foreman. This allows the department to track complaints and maintenance more accurately through employee notes and logs, which has a date and timestamp. Going forward, we would like to use the work order system in more detail by adding equipment that's used, having employees sign in and allocate their time to the job so that we have a better overall understanding of the cost. Entrance permits were also recorded on a piece of paper, and it's a long, messy trail of paperwork that would end up in my check run. Right now, we are entering permits into a work order with deadlines, which makes it much easier to track. We have also started using different attributes as well to ensure that all of the requirements are met, because if they're not checked off, the work order can't be closed. And also using the attributes helps us to collect the correct amount of data and the right data. We would like to use, in future, we would like to use the permit portion of the maintenance manager and take the next step to making the process as seamless as possible. And just because I think it's really important, I wanted to mention that buy-in from the public works staff has been really good, and they are eager to advance further using maintenance manager. Next slide, please. The cherry on top for Michael is the public sector citywide budgeting. Asset management obviously is extremely important in itself, as we all know, But selfishly, the best addition for me has been the PSD Citywide budgeting by far, which is yet another great tool to track all costs, but especially capital asset related costs. We have set up different attributes in the capital asset module to enter at the beginning of the project so that the information is there when we go to enter the asset into Citywide, and then we don't have to bother the department head as much. We used Excel previously to prepare the budget, and every department head would either send me their budget or sit with me and I would have to consolidate it, which was obviously very time consuming. Now each department head enters their own budget other than salaries and inflationary increases, which the latter is done with one easy step. Each department head also has direct access to their budget actuals right at their fingertips, saving me time to prepare the reports for them, and they can make better decisions with more timely information. Next slide, please. The annual budget process time required has decreased substantially, as I just copied from one year to the next, do a couple of inflationary calculations and salaries, and the rest is up to department heads. But the biggest win for me comes from being able to generate reports to answer department head and council questions ahead of time, and then use these reports year after year. I can't say enough about that. I even created reports at a budget meeting to get an answer for council before we left the meeting. My new challenge is report management, because I have so many reports, and some were produced at, let's say, skill level 1, whereas my recent reports are obviously at a higher level, let's say level 3. It's a good problem to have versus doing more grunt work, but I've simply created more folders to address the problem, and I go back and fix the skill level 1 reports when I have a chance. Next slide, please. Thank you. The quarterly budget to actuals report are done in a 10th of the time that it used to take. Instead of spending 90% of the time with preparatory grunt work, I am spending 90% of my time on analysis, which has a huge benefit for our township, with better accuracy for decision making and less stress on me that I'm missing something, which of course is the most important thing. Next slide, please. Thank you. The other benefits of Public Sector Digest budgeting module is that the reports export with formulas in them so that it helps us financial people follow the path of numbers to savings that result in a pot of gold, which I truly believe citywide budgeting has done for us. Now I can fill my days with more value-added activities like playing Pac-Man. Public Sector Digest asset software is very user-friendly, yet it is complex enough to set up things the way you want, but simple enough for even me to use. If you can think it up, PSD can deliver what you need or want. Next slide, please. We have now completed 2 asset management plans with Public Sector Digest, and most recently completed the asset management roadmap, which was very good experience. I learned a lot through that. Like a lot of other municipalities, if we had not had some staff turnover, I think we would be much further ahead than we are now. Different departments in the past have used Excel for a lot of asset replacement schedules, but one advantage of new staff is that it's easier to convince them of the benefits of using just one database. We are trying to improve our data tracking so that we can make better informed decisions through connecting using GPS, using route patrol, adding customer request portal, so that complaints will go directly to maintenance manager. We are also trying to use numbers from the annual requirement report to attempt to put money into reserves to be able to invest and or borrow from ourselves in the future. I really do look forward to seeing where PSD will be in the future. Next slide, please. Goals to meet 2025 requirements, obviously, are to continue to review and refine our asset inventory in consultation with internal department stakeholders. We want to increase our accuracy and confidence in data. We want to utilize Citywide to automate the collection of data to make informed decisions and to forecast our capital needs in the short and long term. We also have it in our 2021 budget to hire an asset management coordinator / public works technical assistant to champion the township's asset management program. But obviously also department heads would work together to prioritize asset management. The third thing that we will focus on is to identify proposed levels of service after tracking the current levels of service for a few years, which, if you're like anybody else, depends on the pants I'm wearing that day, because everything is by the seat of your pants. But we will get to that elephant. We're going to consider public engagement opportunities, and we're also going to identify the necessary life cycle strategy changes required to achieve the proposed levels of service, and whether or not we can afford them. And I think that's where the difficult discussions come in. Like we just went through that exercise with May. Do you get rid of parks or do you keep them? Next slide, please. So obviously, I sincerely wish you good luck with your own asset management journey. It certainly won't be boring, And as Doc would say, is showing my age, great Scots. It's challenging, rewarding, and we will get through it.
Nandini, if you want to unmute and ask Michael.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Michael, amazing presentation. Just a quick question. Perhaps I have missed it. So is there any climate change impact that you have considered into your upcoming asset management plan? More particularly, some of the climate change impacts that are impacting aging assets.
I think certainly climate change, thank you for the question, by the way, and the compliment, which I'll just take and say thank you. It's always a factor. I think you do have to consider every aspect that's going to impact those assets. Obviously, Public Sector Digest is the firm that we'll be using to do any of our asset management plans, and I know that they would put that in there. They're always adding the different pieces of information that you want to consider. And yeah, all life cycle costs, I think all of our managers are getting better at thinking about that when they're purchasing the assets and then how that impacts the whole asset management plan going forward. So absolutely, we would consider climate change and every other thing.
Do we have any other questions for Michael? The lovely Michael, I should say.
Thanks, May. You know you're lovely too. I have a lot of respect for you, but you just keep scaring me every time.
And if you'd like, you can send your question on the chat box. You don't have to unmute and ask your question, so feel free to do that as well.
Well, or of course, I mean, that's one of the great things that the municipal world is awesome about, sharing. Anybody can contact me at any time, and I'd love to help in any way, shape, or form.
Okay, well,
I was just add, this is the view outside of my office when I turn and look outside the window. So told you it's a good spot to live.
All righty. So if we don't have any questions, I think we'll stop here and we'll have our 15-minute break. John, you're good with that?
Perfect. Yeah.
Do I get extra points for finishing early and talking too fast?
No, you were perfect. You were spot on time.
Thank you. I'll tell Heidi.
9:45.
All righty. So thanks, everyone. So we'll convene right back at 9:45. That'll give us a 15-minute break. And we'll see you back soon. Thanks, everyone.
So welcome back, everybody. We have lots to go through, so we're going to stay right on time. Hope everyone's enjoying it so far. It was nice to see the breakout session and all the participation and some great comments coming back. And a big Frontenac, I think for all of you in attendance, it's always good to see the municipal presentations. And see the story at different levels of municipalities. So really enjoyed that. Moving forward, so the next segment, so we have Amanda Brooks joining us from Grey County. And so a slightly larger municipality, of course, about 100,000 people in Grey County. And Amanda's going to talk a little bit about a different kind of approach to meeting the Ontario regulation, but also kind of building all of the key components of their asset management program. So as the title slide says, it's building a robust asset management strategy at Grey County. And I'm just going to do a few intro slides, and then I'm going to pass it over to Amanda. Just got to get my technical abilities in check. Okay, there we are. Right, so if we look at asset management and some of the key elements included, you can see them on the screen. And this comes, once again, I keep mentioning it, international best practice. It all starts with a municipal strategic plan. So that's outside the sphere of asset management, but that strategic plan sets the mission, the vision, the key objectives that the municipality wants to get to, typically over a 10-year plan. And a lot of that will relate to sound fiscal management or infrastructure management services to the public, etc. Then comes along asset management, and the next stage is to do a good, strong asset management policy that will be endorsed, approved by council, and provides direction and alignment to the entire municipal staff. And within that policy, there'll be a problem statement that's going to be achieved, some of the key players that are going to be involved, and some of the key objectives that are going to be met in your asset management program. And that typically ties back to the strategic plan. So there's an alignment coming through. Now, what we've noticed, especially in Ontario, is most municipalities then jump from the asset management policy directly to the asset management plan. And in doing this, they miss international best practice says the next document is an asset management strategy. So we're going to explain that a bit. And Amanda's going to show you what Grey County did with an asset management strategy. The asset management strategy essentially takes the policy and it goes into far more detail. It lays out a series of initiatives that are going to be done by different departments, all in alignment to get to a future goal of more mature asset management programs. So let's discuss that. So the asset management strategy itself, it develops a set of actions aimed at improving asset management practices and programs across the entire municipality. It ensures that these programs and practices are applied consistently, so everybody's on the same page in the way this is rolled out, because they have a guiding document called an asset management strategy. And it is the guiding document that develops consistent asset management programs. And then it meets this holy grail of asset management. You know, how do we ensure that we have set level of service standards that are defined, they are approved by council, everybody understands what they are, and ultimately they are delivered in the field. So that's what a good asset management strategy document gives you. Before I talk about the elements of it, let's talk a little bit about a plan versus a program. A good asset management program really does require the strategy. A plan, they're great, asset management plans are great, but it's always just a finite timeline. It's a snapshot in time. It's the best information available, typically based on last year's financial information. And it's aimed at a specific goal or outcome. Generally, what is the condition of your assets today? What are the future projections on costs? How much money is required to be somewhat sustainable? But if you build a good program instead, you're achieving a set of enduring behaviors and practices that will continue into the future. So this is where you build the culture. And this is where you build the buy-in with your staff. And you build your legacy programs that continue for years into the future. Of course, building an asset management program, as we all know, it's complex. It involves a lot of different players and a lot of different pieces in motion. So that's why the strategy is the guiding document that brings it all together. So what is the process to develop an asset management strategy? So once again, based on best practice, first of all, you want to get all the players in the room. So it's not just about finance. And I think it's interesting. One of my reflections on some of the activities today is there's a term in asset management called accountanteering. And that's where we want the accountants to still be accountants, but to start to think like engineers. And those breakout sessions, we're trying to make you think more like an engineer or a practical field person with some of those metrics. And on the other side of the coin, we want the engineers to still be engineers, but start to think like accountants. So the science of accountanteering, everybody coming together. So you need everybody in the room. And what you want to do is in your discussions, it could be your asset management steering committee. We want you to assess your current state within the municipality. So you're looking at your asset management programs, what's going on with the current practice and processes, what gaps do you currently have in place? And on the next slide, I'm going to help you with some of the elements for this discussion. After you discuss this, you want to start to define a practical and achievable future state for your community. And that means you don't have to get to best practice, but you want to get to a higher level of maturity. And in doing so, you probably want to review some of the best practices out there. You may want to look at some neighboring municipalities who are doing really well. And what gaps do you have that they seem to be doing better? How would you fill those gaps? And then you start to identify some feasible and impactful changes that will get you to this higher level of maturity in your programs that work well for your community. They seem to be achievable. And within the room with all the players, with your public works staff, your operations staff, finance are there, of course, maybe IT, you want to start to build consensus on what these key things are that you're going to address. And then we start to develop the document. We develop the strategy to reach the future state. So you want to develop a path with targets. And this may be a 3-year path. It may be a 5-year path. But the key thing is within the document is far more than asset management policy objectives. Now we're actually listing initiatives, we're listing projects, We're listing tasks with timelines, with ownership. Some tasks will be owned by finance, some will be owned by public works, some will be owned by operations staff. But ultimately on this big Gantt chart, they're all going to be aligned so that at some point in the future, if everybody does the right things on their own task timelines, that it all aligns to bring the whole state of your asset management programs to a higher level of maturity. And that's the idea. So to help those discussions, pretty much my last slide before I hand it over to Amanda, what are some of the key components that you would review and action to look at what gaps you currently have and what initiatives you want to build as you go into the future? So once again, I mentioned it a lot based on international best practice. These are the core components of asset management. You want to look at your strategy and planning, what documents are currently in place and what is missing. And I like the fact that someone in the audience today mentioned, what about climate adaptation? Great question. So it's not just about your asset management documentation. Do you have any strategic documentation related to climate adaptation for your community? And if so, how do you start to align that into your asset management program? Just one example of many. The next thing to look at is organization and people. Do you have the right structure in place to move asset management forward? Do you have dedicated people to asset management, or do you have to work as an asset management committee? Because it's just somewhat off the side of your desk, but many heads together can still move it forward, and that's fine. Do you have the right competencies in place to tackle the discipline? Do you have the right training and skill sets in place as well? And all of these things can be documented. Your asset data and information. Do you have the right data currently collected against your assets? Does it meet standard industry classification? Do you have the right attribute data against those assets in your database so you can do some more sophisticated processes in the future? That will take a while to answer that question, and you can start to document where the gaps are and what initiatives you want to do to make your data more accurate, more current, and more relatable to industry standards moving forward. When it comes to key decision-making, an easy way to answer that question is, how do needs in the field, whether it's roads or whether it's facilities needs, how do they get centralized by some operations group onto standardized lists? And then how do they come forward to senior management so that they get consolidated into the overall list of needs for the municipality across many programs? And how do they ultimately end up in a council chamber as your capital budget for approval? What processes do you have in place? What gaps are there? And how do you close those gaps? And the same could be said for your significantly large operations and maintenance programs. How do you standardize and prioritize those and allocate the right monetary resource to them as well? So I'm going through this quick. That leads us to risk management. Have you addressed risk management? We talked about it a bit earlier. We have a breakout session going in more detail on that as well. If not, what are the gaps you have today? When you look at what others are doing, how do you close those gaps? And then finally, levels of service. Have you defined your levels of service? Number one. And then number two, are you starting to look at what your proposed levels of service will be as you move forward into the future? So with that, thank you very much. That was just an intro. And now I'll turn it over to Amanda Brooks, and Amanda will tell you how Grey County went through that exact initiative of building an asset management strategy.
Good morning, everyone. So as mentioned, I'm Amanda Brooks, and I'm the asset management coordinator for the County of Grey. And just to give you some context, Grey County has a population of approximately 95,000 people and a land area of about 4,500 square kilometers. And we're located a couple hours northwest of Toronto, as you can see on the little map there. The county's current asset portfolio has a total replacement value of about $1.4 billion. And that includes a lot of roads, some culverts, housing units, long-term care homes, recreational trails, forests, the administration and provincial court building, transportation depots, paramedic bases, ambulances, snowplows, trucks, tractors, IT infrastructure, etc. If we go to the next slide, please, John. He's still in control. There we go. So to take you through Grey's asset management journey so far, like most municipalities, Grey started with a lot of informal processes. Then in 2013 and again in 2016, the first two asset management plans were created. And those were as required for gas tax funding, and they were actually completed externally by PSD. Then with the implementation of Ontario Regulation 588-17 in 2018, it was felt there was a need for a full-time asset management coordinator position. And that's when I started with the county. In 2019, we completed our first ever strategic asset management policy to meet the requirements of O.Reg. And then going forward, we were looking to make sure that we could successfully meet all the other requirements of O.Reg, and also to make sure that we had successfully set up our asset management program here at the county. So how did we do that? Well, we found an expert. So we put out an RFP listing all of the things we were looking for our asset management planning and implementation project, and PSD was selected as the successful candidate for that project. Next slide, please. To take you through the project timeline, we started in 2019 with PSD doing some data collection and gap analysis. And then based on that work, they performed a state of the infrastructure report. Also, we did an on-site workshop, and that was probably the most beneficial part I felt of this project, because it was the first time we had all of our asset managers and senior management members all in the same room at the same time. So we could go through what asset management is, why it's important, and how the people in the room should be involved and why it's important to them. Then in 2020, we did a review of our strategic asset management policy, where PSD provided some suggestions to improve our policy. And so we made those changes and had that new policy endorsed by council. They also did a current state assessment on Grey County to assess our current level of asset management maturity. And we did a lot of departmental workshops. And of course, those were virtual in 2020. And those were focusing on levels of service and risk frameworks. So we were able to set those up. Then in 2021, we received our first draft of the asset management strategy. We took that draft to senior management team for their approval. And then it went to council for their endorsement as well. And that strategy document itself was actually about 150 pages, and it contained about 40 recommendations. So those are our next steps that we're working on now to continue moving forward. Next slide, please. So when we started this project, PSD assessed the county as being asset management capable. So we've done a lot of learning on asset management, but we really needed help to start implementing our program here. And next slide, please. And then by the end of the project, they assessed us as being the high intermediate level on the asset management maturity framework. And that's that framework that John had mentioned earlier. And it consists of 7 different elements. So I'm going to take you through each of those 7 elements now and some of the achievements that we made in regards to each one, our challenges that we encountered, and our next steps to continue moving forward. So next slide, please. Element number 1 is organization and people. And I really feel this is the most important element, because if you don't have the right people on board and helping you, it's very difficult to make any advancements. So advancements that we made were that we created our first ever asset management steering committee, and that's a smaller group that meets more regularly, as well as an asset management cross-functional team. And that consists of all of our senior management team members and asset managers from all of our asset owning departments. And that team really doesn't meet as a great big group very often, but we do have smaller meetings within subgroups of that team. Challenges that we've encountered, well, asset management as a formal discipline often becomes a side of desk activity for a lot of people. It's not really part of their day-to-day priorities. So we've found that having the coordinator position really helps to make sure everything keeps moving and stays on track. Also, it's difficult to find alignment between the very different departments that you find in a municipality. I think that municipalities are probably the only organization where you're trying to run a snow removal building business and long-term care facilities, as well as renting out social housing units. So there's some very different business models happening there. And we have found, though, that there are some alignments that can be found to make some efficiencies with just looking at asset classes. So for instance, we have similar maintenance schedules for our social services vans and our snowplows, for instance. Next steps for us will be identifying and documenting our key business processes so that we can then use RACI charts to identify who is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed in regards to each of those processes. Next slide, please. Element 2 is asset information. So advancements that we made, well, we were able to find our data gaps. The challenges then, of course, are filling the data gaps. So we did have some quick wins right off the bat where we just maybe didn't have the information recorded in the right spots, or maybe it was easy to gather and we just hadn't gotten to it yet and officially documenting it. Next steps for us, we're working right now on completing our stormwater inventory, and that's being done by an external consultant. We also just completed another round of building condition assessments, and this time we focused on getting all of our buildings componentized out into their individual components. So we're going to use that data now to split out our building assets in Citywide, our asset manager software, so that we can start to use more realistic life cycle strategies for each component. Because right now those buildings are set up as one structure each in Citywide, and obviously then they're amortized and going over 75 years. And those components obviously have shorter lifespans individually. We're also working on our next iteration of our asset management plan, and that one will be based on 2020 and 2021 data. Next slide, please. Element 3 is strategy and planning. So advancements that we've made, we now have high-level strategical alignment with our senior management team and our council in regards to asset management. But challenges are maintaining the line of sight throughout all levels of the organization. So making sure that our high-level strategy side of things is aligning with the day-to-day practical use of those assets and vice versa. Next steps for us will be, we're actually working on a corporate strategic plan update right now. So once that's available, we'll be able to make sure that our asset management and our strategic plan goals all align. And we want to get our asset management cross-functional team more involved. So that's specifically in the strategy and planning side of things. Next slide, please. Element 4 is asset management decision-making. So advancements, well, we now have condition assessments on almost all of our asset classes, but the challenge is making sure we're gathering good data for decision-making and making sure that we're doing objective assessments when we're looking at those assets and starting to have more documented frameworks to rely upon when doing those assessments, instead of just gathering subjective opinions, so that we can make sure that the data is consistent from year to year. Next steps for us will be implementing a work management software for our transportation services department. So that's underway right now. And it's hoped that with that software, we will then be able to gather data more efficiently and completely and make sure that we have good, strong data to rely on for decision-making. Next slide, please. Element 5 is risk management. So with the help of PSD in this project, we were able to develop risk frameworks for all of our asset classes. But the challenge then, of course, is filling in those risk matrices. So next steps will be to determine our risk data gaps and how to close them. So for example, for our road sections, we want to look at each individual section and consider the proximity to important services such as hospitals and schools, for instance, and also consider the annual average daily traffic count for each of those to see which roads have the greatest risks associated with them. Next slide, please. Element 6 is levels of service. So advancements, we have now defined the current level of service being offered by most of our assets, but the challenge then is developing the proposed levels of service going forward. And I know John has a session on that later today, so I'm looking forward to hearing his words of wisdom on that. Next steps for us will be developing a more customer or community-centric view of asset management planning eventually. So getting the data on our levels of service and the cost associated with each, and then starting to involve our residents and getting some feedback on which level of service they're willing to pay for. And next slide, please. Element 7 is financial management. So an advancement that we made was that for this, or through the strategy, we were able to determine a reasonable annual tax increase amount to reach the required funding level for all of our assets to be fully funded. The challenge, of course, though, is setting the replacement costing values and all of the attributes that are feeding into that required funding level. So next steps for us will be refining and reviewing the cost versus benefits trade-off when looking at each of those individual replacement costs. So do we want to look at the gold standard replacement of road, or are we maybe more or satisfied with a lower cost option instead? The next slide, please. So in conclusion, an asset management strategy helps to provide a very clear path forward with your asset management program. And the work that we did with PSD was very beneficial at the county, and it set us up to continue forward with our asset management. And final slide. So I think now we are happy to take any questions, and thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
That was great. Thank you very much, Amanda. Really appreciate that. And yeah, does anyone have any questions? We're willing to take any questions. If you'd like to put your hand up, if you do have any questions. I was thinking one interesting thing might be good to see in the chat window is, you know, has anyone else done a full-blown asset management strategy like Grey County? I know there are other municipalities in Ontario, but it seems to be the vast majority of people, as I said, go from the policy straight to the asset management plan. And I truly think it's the better approach. And it allowed Amanda as the asset management coordinator to rope in a lot of people into the same initiative. So it worked very well. You must have blown them away, Amanda.
Or put them to sleep.
John, I see that there's a question in the chat. John.
Oh, okay. Let me go there. Sorry, Eunice, it's my lack of technical skills. Yeah, so we do. We had, so maybe over to you, Amanda. How will you be incorporating life cycle costing? Are there challenges you are facing with this?
Yes, there are challenges. So specifically, our building work comes to mind right now. So by splitting our buildings up into their components, that's how we're looking at the life cycle costing for buildings, for instance. So we want to look at the individual replacement costs and useful life of each of those small components within our buildings. But it does get difficult depending on the asset class. So for our roads, how much of the cost do we include in our asset management plan? Like, do we include pothole patching, for instance? And I think that'll get easier as we have a better work management software so that we can start to track all of the costs that are associated with each of those assets.
That's great. Thanks. Another question from Vivian Job. Amanda, can you tell us a little bit more about the risk assessment?
Yes, so we started with looking at the different, I guess, components of risk. So environmental, social, health and safety, all of those types of high level risk. And then looking at within each asset category, what specific risks there might be. So obviously for roads, there's some climate and environmental risks when you're looking at freeze thaw cycles. And there's also health and safety when you're looking at, you know, the likelihood of accidents and things like that. So it depends on the asset class, and then we go from there and we get the people involved that know those assets the best. So for roads, we had a lot of our maintenance and engineering folks in the room when we were doing that discussion. And that really helped to kind of lay out which risks were the most important. And then we could assign a weighting to each of those as well.
Excellent. And just one more question, so we stay on time. A question from A. Selby, I think that's the name. How receptive were the county council to the asset management concepts you presented to them?
They were very receptive, especially when you start pointing out that there's a huge lack of funding. We have a few counselors that are definitely kind of ambassadors for asset management, which has really made my life easier. So they really cling on to, this is the lack of funding we have, and this is why we need to increase the taxes for our assets and make sure that we're able to offer the services that our residents need. So that's been very helpful.
Excellent. Thanks very much, everyone, for the questions. And if we didn't get to some questions, we will try and answer some after the session as well. Thank you so much, Amanda. That was a great presentation. I really appreciate you being on board with us today.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you. And so next we're gonna move into the next interactive session, and that will be so with Jordan Gonda, another one of my esteemed colleagues here at PSD. And Jordan, he's an engineer, and he's going to take you through a session on life cycle management and risk. So remember that science of accountaineering piece I talked about earlier. So this is where we challenge somewhat the finance folks, still to be finance folks, but to think a little bit technical, and maybe think that if you did have your public works or your engineering folks with you, what would they bring to the table with this interactive session? So I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass the presentation over to Jordan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. So this is a great segue from Amanda's presentation on the strategy. So there are some great questions on how do we do risk assessments? How do we capture life cycle costs? I hope this exercise will at least give you an idea of how that's done. I just want to go through the concepts really briefly before we break out. Life cycle in a nutshell is really about how do we account for all the costs through the life. So it's one thing to know how much a facility or vehicle costs when you acquire it, but over time, we're going to do different kinds of maintenance, rehabilitation. You might repair a roof, engine rebuild. All these things cost money. And if we have a good sense of what these do and what these cost, we can make better decisions. We can try and optimize that limited budget expenditure. At a very basic level, we want to put together a life cycle strategy. It's really looking at three different components. What are the trigger, the impact, and the costs? So at a starting point, when you're putting together a life cycle program, you can start by putting together a table like this. You can go and talk to the experts. That could be the facility manager, public works, engineers. This is an example of a road. We identify different kinds of life cycle activities, like crack sealing, like a single lift overlay, double lift overlay. And we see in this table, we identify when they're applied, whether that's a specific time period, a specific condition state, PCI score. We set that trigger, we set the impact, and we set the costs. Putting together a program in this way will allow you to capture and budget those costs long-term. And then above that, if we have a way to model those impacts, we can even see what kind of savings that strategy provides. So again, the strategy is all about just identifying those activities, when they're done, and what the costs are. We want to supplement the life cycle with the risk. So it's not just knowing what we're doing, but if we have limited resources, how can we prioritize? How can we know what's critical? Risk assessment in best practice is done at two levels. We have the strategic risk. So that is not the specific asset, but that's the risk of achieving the overall life cycle strategy. That is often done through interviews, through identifying trends and influencers. As Amanda mentioned, it could be things like extreme weather, the freeze thaw cycles. And then we can drill down deeper at the asset level. So now this is looking at what John was describing briefly at the beginning. Can we build a model with probability and consequence? And can we consider the different economic, social, environmental, health and safety, and operational impacts? In your assignment today, or this breakout group, it'll be focused more on the strategic level. Here's just three examples of what you can see. Again, anything from extreme weather, uncertain grant funding opportunities. Maybe if you don't get that grant funding, you renew critical work, and data. We have sanitary and storm systems. If we don't know where that inflow and infiltration is, we can't have targeted solutions. So these are just three examples of what kind of strategic risks you can see. So I'm just going to bring up the exercise. Okay, so you should see a PDF. I hope everyone had a chance to download it. If not, there's a link in the chat room. So we have three different exercises. We've developed a facilities, a vehicles, and a fleet exercise. It's really in two sections. The first section is the exercise itself. So what you'll see is a description of a life cycle strategy. And if you scroll down, there'll be a proposed levels of service. And this is where you get to put input of how we'll adapt it. So at the end of your exercise, there is an example. So I just quickly go through the roads example, and I'm hoping you can kind of build on that and use that for your exercise. So you'll see different activities for operations and maintenance, for rehabilitation, different activities like single surface mill and pave, etc., how inspections are done. In this example, we're interested in being more proactive and saving costs. So if I was doing this exercise, I would suggest different changes to the strategy. Things like doing more third-party assessments, being more proactive with their maintenance strategy, doing a second rehabilitation event. And then at the very end, I know what kind of risks we have. So, freeze thaw cycles, reliance on grant funding, all these are very valid. I know everyone in this room isn't necessarily an expert in their asset category they're going to do, but just think of it in terms of the process of identifying, adapting strategies. Be creative. Feel free to discuss with the group. So the way we have this broken out, there's about 28 groups, so you're all numbered. Groups 1 through 10, you'll be working with the facilities exercise. 11 to 20 is vehicles, and 21 to 28 is trails. So I'll give you 15 minutes, and then we'll all reconvene as a group. I hope everyone had good discussions and had a few good points to put down. So I guess, is there anyone that wants to volunteer before I start calling on names? Okay. So let me bring up. Okay. So I have the vehicles one open, so maybe I'll just start going through here. So we have 10 minutes to go through some of these. So let's just look at what we're getting at here. The idea with the fleet exercise for the proposed levels of service is that we found over time the program has become more reactive, resulting in increased capital expenses. To ensure financial sustainability, the asset management team has set proposed levels of service over the next 10 years to reduce the fleet capital and operating expenses by 20%. So we're looking at here, how can we reduce overall costs from this current program? So we look at the exercise, what we're doing, we have circle checks by staff, we do routine maintenance by external mechanics. Does anyone have a suggestion maybe of how we can adapt that to maybe save some costs? So if we want to achieve that proposed cost savings, what can we do? Yes, Mark.
Yeah, you'll have to excuse us on this in case with us because none of us in our group are asset managers in the instance, so we don't know if we're offside on this and that. But we were saying, especially when we're looking at external mechanics, and now we're like, oh, typically an external mechanic, you're not just paying them for the actual cost of it, but also whatever their profit margin is. So we're saying, okay, do we either try to bring that in-house, so like see if it is more cost effective for us to do it in-house, or is it something that we could like RFP to try to bring the price down? Like maybe we are paying too much currently for the externals.
Well, that's a very great point, Mark. And that's something I see quite a lot, is that there's a lot of cost savings by internalizing the work. So try to internalize The mechanic, even do an RFP process. Those are very great points, and those can save costs over time. So yeah, very great point. And again, this can also apply to the heavy duty. That is a bit more specialized. So depending on the size of your municipality, you might not have enough work for an internal mechanic. But again, if you're larger, you'll probably have that centralized. If we move down, so we have in the rehab and replacement. Oh, sorry, Donna. Yes,
Sorry.
Donna.
One of the things we also thought, if you brought the mechanic in-house, that you might be able to be more proactive. If you could train staff when problems come up, that you could identify them, be more proactive in actually dealing with them, as opposed to just doing it on a regular maintenance schedule.
Yes, definitely. Because yeah, they're there and you can set the schedule of how often they assess, and it'll be much more timely. Great. I guess any other comments before we go to the rehabilitation section? Okay, so what we see is there's no long-term replacement schedule, generally replaced as budget allows, and at times the vehicles are utilized beyond the service life that you've outlined in the fleet maintenance policy. Prioritization is by age only, and we only consider brand new vehicles. So now if we go beyond just the operating and maintenance, how can we save some costs, for example, through the proposed replacement strategy? Yes, Mark.
Yeah, we were saying that if we've got all these 50-point inspections and these different reports coming in of their of the vehicles and that, we were saying, well, we can switch, instead of doing it by age, by actual the actual life and value of it. So yes, we might have a two-year-old light vehicle on that, but if it's an absolute lemon, we should be replacing it before the 15-year-old workhorse that doesn't seem to break down ever. So we should be doing it based on actual condition and adjusting it that way, since we already have the reports.
Yes, and definitely condition. We mentioned value. Could you maybe just expand on that?
On which, sorry?
Sorry, you said condition and value. Would that be the value that the vehicle provides to the community?
Yeah, value, and also we can also see the cost or something that's being attributed to it, to say, okay, well, how many times has it been going back to the shop and all that kind of stuff, saying, okay, this one is starting to suck a lot of money versus another one. Yes,
definitely. That's where work order management really comes into play. I'll just take just from you, Donna, and then I'll move over to facilities. So yes, Donna.
Yeah, so the only other thing that we maybe talked about, again, condition or mileage as a way of replacing it, but also maybe looking if it's more appropriate to look at maybe greening the fleet, if you can save some operating costs by buying something, or looking at different ways of acquiring it, like maybe leasing or used, whatever it is, to kind of change your strategies a bit.
Yes, great point. So leasing or used instead of buying brand new, and greening fleet. Awesome. I'd love to take more, but I'll just for interest of time, I'll move on to the facilities. Just give me 1 second here to bring it up. Oh, I do have it here. Okay, so for facilities, we have a little different scenario here. The buildings are quite old, reaching the end of their service life, constructed in the 70s and 80s, no major retrofits. But we found from surveys that residents are willing to accept a tax rate increase if it means more program capacity and more modern amenities. So this is kind of the opposite of the last one. We're not looking at saving costs, but how can we improve performance? So how can we modernize our facilities? So that's the kind of level of service we're going towards. If we look at what we're doing right now, we have staff do internal building walkthroughs. However, there's no structured committee. There's nothing's recorded digitally. The last building condition assessment is 20 years old, is quite outdated. And the maintenance is generally done as needed by staff observations. So if we want to look at improving the maintenance and operations end of things, so how we assess, how we do internal inspections, what kind of changes might we make? So again, any comments from groups 1 to 10? Yes, Gordon.
Hi. Yes, our group, we thought the first thing they need to do is find out where they are, institute some regular inspections like weekly, monthly by the staff or the Health and Safety Committee, and perhaps do a semi-annual detailed. We were thinking maybe in the fall before the ice goes in and in the spring. And then, as you say, it's been 20 years. They need some specialty outside staff, like maybe an architect that specializes in roofs, a refrigeration specialist, HVAC, try and figure out where they are. And if it's like a lot of these buildings, they're probably going to have to come up with some kind of replacement plan. It doesn't say if we have one facility or we have several, but assuming we have several, you probably won't be able to do it all at once. So maybe you find that the one facility, if you do a bit of rehab work, it'll last another 10 or 15 years, but maybe one has to be replaced right away. So, and stepping back, you kind of have to look at your community. I know that's the thing where we are. Do you need the same number of ice pads, or has the demographics changed? Maybe they need indoor soccer or something like that. So, yeah, they have a lot of things to do, and they probably can't handle it all internally, and definitely not on an ad hoc basis.
Yes, that's some very, very great points, Gordon. You pretty much completed the whole exercise. Just to recap, some key points here is that we can do more frequent inspections, organize a formal health and safety committee, conduct a more modern building condition assessment, do specialists, all very great points. We just have time for one more if there's anyone else that wants to provide input. Yes, Jay Farrington.
For the proposed capital planning process, we talked about setting up an annual reserve fund transfers built in the operating budget, so they're not hit all at once with a huge increase, and then using the building condition assessment to identify any future expenditures, and then we can build all that stuff in as well.
Yes, yeah, great point. So yeah, definitely set up a reserve. You know, we have that money there proactively using the BCA. That's all in line with industry practice. Thank you. So we're going to move on. So again, these will be available after the workshop. I'll turn it back over to John to finish up the segment.
Yeah, thanks a lot once again, Jordan. I think that was a great breakout session, and I'm sure there was some good conversations. And it was nice to get some really good feedback there. And thanks for those people who did put their hand up. Yeah, and it was really good. And thanks to May as well. I really appreciate that, guys. You did a great job. We'd like to finish up then. So the last half an hour, we'd like to talk about this proposed level of service. And of course, at the end of the Ontario regulation, this is not until the 2025 asset management plan, but as well as depicting, current level of service, you now have to say, what is your proposed level of service for all your asset categories, and how do you intend to get there over the next 5 years? 10 years, sorry. I'm just gonna take that. So this is going to take some work, and I think we need to start today, and it's going to include some planning and also some good communication as well. So this slide may look a little bit cheesy, but I think what I'm saying is when the opportunity knocks, the brave and the bold amongst us, we answer the door. And I think that is really key, because to me, this is a big opportunity, and I'm going to explain that on the next slide. So what is the opportunity? So I worked for 20 years in the city of Hamilton, the last 10 years, the head of the asset management program there. And if someone gave me this opportunity, I would think it was fantastic. So the opportunity to establish proposed levels of service for all of your key municipal infrastructure services that will be communicated through the council, endorsed and approved by your council, along with an achievable financial strategy, a monetary envelope to allow you to get there. And ultimately, if you do it well, you can tie it to a 10-year listing of capital projects. So it's not quite the lottery. We're not winning the lottery here. We're not imagining the freedom, but we can start to imagine the efficiencies that come from this process. So everything's been approved with a financial strategy and monetary envelopes to match for the next 10 years if you do this well in 2025. What does that bring? Efficiencies to your capital budget. You can get ahead of all kinds of things. You have listed projects for the next 10 years. You can get ahead of your surveys in advance. You can get ahead on coordinated projects where you may be bringing roads, sewer, water elements together, those complicated pieces. You can get ahead on the design work and the various inspection processes that have to happen to get detailed project information as you move forward. You can get ahead on your procurement practices. How do you put better contracts out into the market earlier than other municipalities to get better pricing from the contractors? How do you cluster like-minded works together? Because now you have a long-term program in place. So once again, you get better economies of scale on your contracts. So all kinds of efficiencies can come from this if you do it well. How would you approach this opportunity? It's a pretty obvious slide. You take the first step. And I would say once you take the first step, it's not walking up the stairs, you're walking down the stairs. It's going to get easier as you go. So it's going to take some good planning, some good communication, but you want to start as soon as possible. You're looking at your current levels of service, but you want to start these conversations on what will the proposed level of service look like, but what analysis do we need to get there? So let's look at the planning to get there. So we talk about this a lot. It's the same story. You got to gather all the players together. I think with all the finance folks at this conference, you've done a great job on these breakout exercises, but I'm sure you could probably reflect that if you had some more technical folks in your breakout sessions, they may have helped with some of these questions that you had to answer. So, asset management is a team sport, as we always say. It's a multidisciplined approach. Utilize your asset management steering committee if it's already in place, and you should have finance folks, yourselves, engineering folks, public works, the other line departments, the facilities folks, the fleet folks, IT people, some of the data gurus who can help you with some reporting. And someone mentioned, once again, climate adaptation. Maybe environmental folks should now come into the picture, because infrastructure is one of the key elements being affected by a changing climate. Everyone should be at the table. And I'm going to talk about some of the discussions you can have, but with that, you want a governance framework where you establish avenues of communication that periodically go up to your senior management table. So someone from the SMT, senior management team, should be on your steering committee, and they can be your communication avenue. And similarly, you want a communication avenue to council on a periodic basis as well, to educate them in what is levels of service and what is your progress in analyzing what your proposed levels of service will be. So as a steering committee, when you get all the players together, you want to reflect on some straightforward things. You want to reflect on what's happening now, but you want to reflect on the future, of course, as well. What are we going to look like 10 years down the road? So for the now question, are the current infrastructure assets adequately supplying services to meet the community's needs? And that's a good discussion. And if you go infrastructure category by category, you may find maybe not in all cases, that a good discussion into itself. As you look to the future, we've talked about the influences, the trends and factors throughout today. What should be considered for the future? And I've just put some key bullets that you should think about, but certainly changes in population within your community. And moreover, changes in the demographic. Would you have, for instance, more of an aging population, so they need different types of recreation program than what you required in the past? Another trend due to COVID, people can work from wherever. So people are leaving the GTA, for instance, they go into more of the rural municipalities because they feel it's a nicer place to live. But when they get there, they expect to still have the big city services in a small town. So there's a changing expectation from that changing population as well. What about economic development goals? How is that going to affect the provision of infrastructure to meet those economic development goals? Environmental sustainability from your underground networks, as you look towards climate adaptation. Then other just big ticket things like the condition of your existing assets. Do you have more assets moving towards poor condition and they just need additional work and more monetary resource applied to them? And what about service affordability within your community? What is the average income level? What is your tax rates already at in comparison with surrounding municipalities? Do you have the flexibility to increase taxes, or are you somewhat restrained? What is your threshold on capital debt? There's all kinds of things you can look at under that particular bullet. And unexpected events. Have you had flooding? Have you had forest fires, drought? All of these unexpected events that are happening as well. And this helps us to reflect on service provision for the future. So let me bring you down to a basic example, and this gets into a little bit more detail. I'm going to try and not belabor this too much. But if we looked at the road network, for instance, and we wanted to discuss this proposed level of service, you're going to find that the road network as a whole, its one level of service will not fit all of the roads within the road network. And you're probably better to subcategorize the road network based on risk and performance. So a lot of your level of service analysis should start with some good risk assessment. And Jordan spoke to this quite well. So if you look at the diagram at the bottom, some of the larger municipalities may have a freeway or a large highway running through them. Nearly every municipality has roads that are at the arterial functional level, the collector distribution functional level, or finally the local roads that just lead to people's driveways. And these roads have a different degree of through traffic movement and speed. A highway up to 100 kilometers an hour with very high traffic volumes, down to local roads, 40 kilometers an hour, very low traffic volumes, almost a glorified driveway, if you wish. There's different risk factors to be managed. So I would say start by grouping your asset categories based on the risk that needs to be managed, and then start to look at the proposed level of service that should be put in place accordingly. And that brings forward better allocation of funding and better prioritization of your future projects to meet this proposed level of service as well. So let me explain that a little bit better on this slide. And there's a lot of information on this. So we talked earlier about the international standard for level of service is premised on level of service of any asset category is balanced by the performance of that asset category in the field. So it could be your roads, could be your water distribution, could be your portfolio of facilities, the amount of cost that's put into the program, and the amount of risk that is carried to service failure as we move forward into the future. Now, if we were looking at the roads, we could say we need to answer questions on each piece of this triangle on the different functional classes, the highways, the arterials, the collectors, the local roads, special requirement roads. If it was water distribution, just to touch on it quickly, you would look at different diameter sizes of pipes, and you would treat the treatment plant as a separate status because a treatment plant must always be available. If it was your park assets, think about the different types of parks you have. You may have small parkettes. It's almost like a park bench with a couple of trees. You have a community park that may have a splash pad and a small playground. You have that's a neighborhood park, sorry. You have a community park that may have a number of sport fields, for various groups to utilize. And then you may have a citywide park that has large events for the entire community. So they would have different levels of service. So let's stay on the road one. So if we looked at these ones individually, what types of questions would we ask ourselves on the performance side of this equation? So if we looked at highway roads compared with local roads, we would have a different condition requirements. Too many potholes on a highway could be a major risk. It could cause major accidents. So, you're looking at, just to make it a short story, your condition out of 100%, you want to be up in about the 80 range, on the highway, and you don't want it to slip below. But on the local roads, maybe we can go as low as 50%, or maybe 60% is satisfactory, depending on other resources available. Capacity, do we need extra lanes on these roads? Some of the larger arterial roads carry buses, they carry truck routes. Do we have capacity issues? Do they need extra turning radiuses? All kinds of technical questions that could be answered on the performance side, on the functional requirements. Special requirements, this comes down to, you may have a subsection of roads that you now in your transportation plan have said, we're going to have multi-use paths alongside these roads. We're going to have cycle lanes. It may be roads going through a business improvement area or the downtown core. You have special furniture off to the side of the road. You have decorative street lighting. You have all kinds of additional elements, special sidewalks, stamped concrete that you may not have on other roads. So that's an additional performance characteristic you need to answer. After you answer those questions, and this would take some time, but it's great for your asset management steering committee with all the right players. Then you could look at your risk, and you look at corporate risk. So in terms of the road network, what is the size of the current infrastructure deficit? How big is the backlog? How many deferred projects are on the list that we haven't got to? At the network level, what are the risks on various classes of road to get to this performance standard? And where are the risks from a health and safety point of view, and just a service failure point of view? It may be bridges within the transportation network that have load limits and that type of thing. And then we can score the individual assets, of course, and we can even include climate risks. And how do we do that? There will be roads in your community that are more exposed and more vulnerable to climatic events just because of the geographical location. And you can score them on a risk matrix to have a higher degree of risk attached to them as well. So I'm trying to cover a lot on this slide, of course. It would be a lot of analysis. And then currently in most municipalities, the budget comes first, and everyone tries to meet performance and risk standards against the budget. And I would say, to do proposed levels of service properly, let's do performance and risk first, and then try and get a budget envelope to match. So what is the cost? The cost should be enough to attain the performance requirements. What is the cost for risk? The cost should be enough to mitigate your risks to a certain threshold standard. And that will take some analysis. Once you've done all of that work on your proposed level of service, you want to look at how you can start to generate different scenarios. So develop scenarios for each of the asset groups that clearly shows cost, risk, and performance levels. Discuss and determine them as your asset management steering group, but take some clear recommendations forward to council and senior management. And the graph is pretty basic, but what we're saying is this is a scenario run in a decision support system. PSD has such a system. And we could say for this asset grouping, we want an average condition of 65 out of 100. That means we need a max spend of 1.2 million per year. And that brings our risk metric down to 2.5 out of 10, for instance. So this will take a lot of analysis to get there. Very quickly, because not a lot of time, how can you communicate this? So in real estate, they say it's all about location, location, location. And a little bit of a cheesy message, but it's very true. In asset management, it's all about communication, communication, communication. We're almost like the salespeople selling a new business philosophy to senior management and council. And we got to communicate all the time. And when we communicate, it's taking the messages to senior management and council almost like we're talking to the public. And it's better received by council when you do that. So asset management, we talk about it as service management. The asset is really just a conduit for a service to the public. And I like to say that the core assets, roads, water, wastewater, stormwater, that's just the foundational elements of our modern societies, often taken for granted, and people just expect them to be there. But where would we be without them? Imagine a day where they shut down all the roads in your municipality. Imagine a day with no water across the municipality. It's unimaginable. And then the other good stuff is the quality of life in your municipality. So we all like to say, you know, I live in a municipality where we have lots of trails. We have great parks for the kids. We have great sports programs. We have great recreation facilities. You know, this is the quality of life, and this is how we want to communicate that going forward. And that brings me to this slide, who influences who? And in municipal government, sometimes we feel like we're getting the gears, and it's a bit of a cheesy expression. So I say this a bit tongue in cheek, and I'm trying to be respectful, but sometimes it feels like the gears are all going clockwise, and council give municipal staff the gears by giving direction, which we don't always agree with, and we follow that direction out to the public. But how do we turn the cogs of the wheel the other way? So how do we instead have good communications within our presentations to council, which is a public forum, good communications on our website that go out with our asset management plans, and we generate good communications on proposed levels of service so that municipal staff are actually directing the public to pay attention, to get involved in the conversation, and in turn to influence council. So who gives who the gears is the question. And we want to keep doing big picture messages in our asset management plans. A lot of folks are already doing this. So, you know, everyone has that graph where they say, you know, for instance, what's our replacement cost of infrastructure in the community? We have $1.3 billion. What does that mean? You sound like a big company on the stock market to the average member of the public. But if you say instead, within this community of the $1.36 billion of infrastructure, the person in the average home has a share of $75,000 worth of infrastructure within their own community. They now have ownership in that community. And now they realize I pay my taxes and maybe a few $1,000s a year, but they're not just picking up my garbage and plowing the street. I'm actually all this infrastructure I share of in my own community. And they start to understand the cost to do that. And it takes time. You have to reiterate the same message again and again. Another message I used many years ago in Hamilton, but I like this one, was just comparing average daily household costs with the cost of infrastructure services. So this can be used again as we get into this proposed level of service communication. So you would do this. You would say, we've gone through the performance parameters, we've gone through the risk, and now we've worked out we need this level of monetary envelope. And now it's millions of dollars on a budget. So then divide that by the number of households that we're going to be paying into that program, divide it into the number of days per year, and now you've got a daily household cost to cover the cost of that program. When we did this in the past for all of the water infrastructure and the plants and thousands of kilometers of water main below the street, it ended up that to be sustainable at a certain level of service for water, we need less than $1 a day off every person in the municipality. And that's less than what a lot of people pay for bottled water, one bottle of water. It's amazing. If you update this on daily household costs today, just look at Stats Canada. Your average Canadian thinks nothing about spending $3 a day on coffee and a bagel, cable TV, $2.50, et cetera, et cetera. It's a good way to take the message to the public that, you know, we don't tell you well enough the value you're getting for the taxes you pay and what you get for those taxes. And we can tell you in dollars and cents what you could get for a proposed level of service in the future and start to have a true conversation on what are you willing to pay for. So I'm going quick just in the interest of time. And with that, everyone used to bring a report card in their asset management plans. You know, we have a B rating in this asset and a C. But now I think our report card should look at the costs, the performance, and the risk associated with our asset classes. And we can explain that to council. So this is in simple terms. We would say to council with 2 bars on a graph, this is what we currently spend on average for this asset class. But to be sustainable, we need this much money. And it's a direct comparison. And councillors, currently today for this asset program, this is the percentage of assets in very good, fair, poor condition. And this is the percentage of your assets that are in very high, moderate, all the way to very low risk. And you start to explain that. And then you generate a report card that says, here we are in 2021. So you start to get ahead of the game. So they start to understand this. And for our road network, on average, we have about 1.1 million available. We need to get to about 2.1 million to be truly sustainable. And today, the average condition, we look about nearly 40% of our assets are either in poor or very poor condition. That's concerning. And we have about 26% of the assets in the very high or high risk level. We've quantified through a lot of detailed analysis, this is just the final communication, that we don't have to get to the 2.1 million. We can actually get to about 1.75 would work well for our community. It would allow us to bring our performance on the very poor and poor side to be less than 20%. So we have the amount of assets in that range. And we want to get our risk levels from 26% down to less than 15%. We think that's palatable, and we could take that to the community for a conversation. And then you get the similar type of vein for the water network as well. Now, the key thing is, if you start doing this early, you can take this information year upon year to council, regardless if you're delivering an asset management plan or not, make it part of your capital budget deliberation, and just keep updating where you at. Are you closing the gap on your condition? Are you getting better? Are you closing the gap on high and very high risk assets? Are you getting better? Or is there still work to be done as you move towards this proposed level of service? So some simple messages can work quite well. And in the interest of time, I went fairly fast, but I think we have 5 minutes for questions. So at this point, I'd like to actually, I'd like to bring my colleagues as well over as well, and we can field any questions you have. And I'm going to open the chat function. And I'm just wondering if there's any, if you could put in your chat, and thanks Jordan and May for joining me. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask us, we have 5 minutes to take that. If they want to have any comments on Michael McGovern from Central Frontenac's presentation, or Amanda Brooks from Grey County, feel free as well. It was fantastic. It's fantastic having them join us as well. I'm not seeing anything coming up in the chat. May's jumping in to help me with the technical abilities, which is fantastic. It's truly appreciated.
We have a question here from Marcia. How do you handle the fear of presenting risk to failure info?
I think that's, yeah, and it's a very good question. Thank you, Marsha. And I've seen you put quite a few comments in today, which is great. We really appreciate that. You know, we shouldn't be fearful of taking risk even to a council chamber. Every program has some element of risk, and you will never 100% eliminate risk. So it's educating council in what is risk. So it's back to that probability of failure and consequence of failure. But supplying the fact that we want to mitigate risks as much as possible on those assets that have a high consequence of failure to community services. So, you know, the easy way to look at that is, you know, think about a culvert compared with a bridge. A culvert on a road, if it fails, we have public works crews that can go out that day and they can fix that culvert. It's not a big issue. It's not a high consequence of failure. If a bridge fails, you know, that's going to be front page news the next day. So we can't eliminate all risk to council. We educate them on what it is, but we're going to eliminate risk on the high risk assets that will contribute to high consequence of failure. I think that's the best way to do it, through education. Any other questions from anybody? Thanks, Marsha. So N. Dewitt, are you aware of any Ontario municipal public documents that quantifies current versus proposed level of service for any municipal service? Yeah, we're starting to see a lot of examples of this. I can't cite municipalities themselves. We've done this in some of our own asset management plans. I've seen some of the larger municipalities start to do this in Ontario as well with other asset management plans. So it's fairly new, but it is starting to get traction, and it is out there in some of the public documents. Jordan, May, any additional comments to that? Okay, we have a question from Michael McGovern. Can you send out some examples, John? Some of us need help to give ideas. And yeah, absolutely. We will. Thanks for that, Michael, and appreciate you being with us today. Yeah, we will look for some of those examples, and we can share them through MFOA that can be distributed with all of the material from today as well. So, yeah.
And I think just as a comment on that too, it's the proposal vary community to community, so it's not always wouldn't always make sense to benchmark yourself against your neighbor. They may have different environment, different demographics. So it's really about your situation and the residents that you serve.
Yeah, right on. Any other questions from anybody?
I'm just seeing if anyone's raised their hands. It's for MFOA staff, so maybe Abigail or Eunice, you could answer this one.
So the question is, excuse me, will there be a working group developed to create standards/suggestions for commuting with the public regarding proposed levels of service? Since all municipalities are required to do this, I think it'd be a great initiative to determine specific questions to ask residents as well as communication strategy. Thank you so much, Amanda. We will take that back to the organization and we will follow up with you in the future. Thank you. And then there's a couple of more questions at the bottom. Maybe we'll have time for one.
Absolutely. I like the one Tracy Nefer has put in a question. For public consultation, how much planning timing do you recommend? And this is key. And don't jump into public consultation too early. You need good information. You want to start your public consultation sessions, not just asking what everyone wants. You want to educate first. So going through some of the kind of key communication tools we talked about and really planning out what is your proposed levels of service in relation to performance, risk, and cost allows you to generate some really good educational information from the public in line with the influences and trends that we've all talked about as well with your own community. And then you get to a series of questions where you solicit feedback and make them part of the conversation. So that's the planning exercise. You want to get to a good level of detail of analysis. So you have some good recommendations you can take forward to those sessions, and you want to have some good, clear communication materials. And then it's excellent to bring the public in because you want to absolutely solicit their feedback. So yeah, I hope I answered that well. And I think it would be great. MFOA have done some really good sessions on the roadmap that they're rolling out. And I think that would be a fantastic session that someone suggests to include some public consultation pieces. And with that, I think we're pretty much done time-wise. I'm going to pass it back to MFOA because I know they've got in the break, I think they're going to get everyone up and dancing, and I wouldn't like to break into everyone's time for that. Thank you for allowing us to be here today, and I hope everyone has a great day. Back to you to Eunice or Abigail. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank John, May, and Jordan from PSD Citywide, and Michael and Amanda for sharing their knowledge and experience and expertise with us today.